The morning sun cast long shadows across the Montana ranch as Jake moved through his daily routine, like a ghost walking through his own life. 3 years had passed since the accident, but time hadn't healed anything. It had just made the pain feel heavier, like a weight he carried in his chest that grew bigger each day. At 45, Jake had once been the kind of man who could light up a room with his laugh. His neighbors still remembered the barbecues he used to throw, the way he'd help anyone who needed it, how his eyes would sparkle when he talked about his plans for the ranch. But that man had died along with his wife in that twisted metal on Highway 89. What remained was just someone going through the motions, keeping the cattle fed and the bills paid. Because he didn't know what else to do, his boots crunched on the gravel as he walked toward the barn. The sound was the same every morning, but it felt different now. Everything felt different without her voice calling out from the kitchen window, asking if he wanted coffee before he started work. The silence had become so normal that he almost forgot what it felt like to have someone care about whether he came in for breakfast. The ranch hands had learned not to try making conversation. Jake paid them well and treated them fair, but he wasn't the same boss who used to joke around and ask about their families. Now he just gave instructions and walked away. They worried about him, but what could they say? A man's grief was his own business, and Jake wore his like armor that nobody could get through. Meanwhile, across town in a neighborhood where the houses were smaller and the dreams felt further away, 28-year-old Rosa was learning what it meant to be afraid of your own shadow. She hadn't always been this way. There were pictures hidden in a shoebox under her bed that showed a different woman, one who smiled without checking over her shoulder first, who wore bright colors and had plans for the future, but that was before Danny, before she learned that love could turn into something that hurt more than being alone. Before she understood that some people saw kindness as weakness and trust as an invitation to take control of everything that mattered to you. Rosa had been a teacher once. She remembered the feeling of walking into her classroom, seeing the eager faces of her students, knowing that she was making a difference in their lives. But Danny had convinced her that the job was taking too much of her time, that she should focus on their relationship instead. One by one, he had found reasons why she shouldn't see her friends, why her family didn't understand their love, why she needed to depend on him for everything. The bruises started small. A grip that was too tight when he was making a point. Shove when she asked the wrong question. Danny was always sorry afterward, always had an explanation that made it sound like it was her fault for pushing him too far. And Rosa, who had grown up believing that good people tried to see the best in everyone, kept believing that the man she fell in love with was still in there somewhere, but Danny had debts. Big ones, the kind that came with threats and deadlines and people who didn't care about explanations. Rosa didn't know the details, but she could see the fear in his eyes when certain phone calls came in. She could feel the tension in the apartment when he thought she wasn't looking. And she noticed how he started looking at her differently, like she was something he owned rather than someone he loved. The idea came to him during one of those late-night conversations with the kind of men who collected on debts. Rosa was in the bedroom, but the walls were thin, and she heard enough to make her blood run cold. Danny was talking about her like she was a car he could sell, a problem he could trade away to buy himself more time. She tried to tell herself she was imagining things. People didn't actually do that, did they? This was America, the 21st century. But deep down, she knew that when someone has complete control over your life, when you have nowhere to go and no one to call for help, the impossible becomes possible. The first time Danny brought someone to the apartment to meet her, Rosa felt something die inside her chest. The man looked at her the way you'd look at a horse you were thinking about buying, checking her teeth and asking questions about her health. Danny answered for her, his hand tight on her shoulder as a warning to stay quiet. Word spread through the kinds of places where these conversations happened. Rosa didn't know how these networks worked, but she could feel them closing in around her. Men started showing up at the diner where she worked her part-time job, asking the other waitresses about her. Danny started bringing home more visitors, each one making her feel smaller and more frightened. The worst part wasn't the fear of what might happen to her. It was the realization that she had let herself become someone who could be traded away, like property. The woman who had once taught children to believe in themselves had forgotten how to fight for her own worth. Back at the ranch, Jake was fixing a broken fence post when his ranch hand Tommy approached him. Tommy was young, maybe 25, with the kind of energy that reminded Jake of himself at that age. He was also one of the few people who still tried to talk to Jake like a human being instead of walking on eggshells around him. "Boss," Tommy sighed, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. "I need to talk to you about something. It's kind of serious." Jake looked up from the post he was setting. Tommy had his girlfriend Linda working at the diner in town, and she heard all the gossip that flowed through the coffee cups and pie plates. Usually, Jake didn't care much about town talk, but something in Tommy's voice made him pay attention. "There's this woman," Tommy continued. "Linda knows her from the diner. Name's Rosa. She's in trouble. Bad trouble." Jake waited for more information, but Tommy seemed to be struggling with how to explain it. Finally, he just said it straight. "Out. Her boyfriend's trying to sell her, boss. Like she's property or something. Linda heard it from 3 different people now. There's guys coming around asking about her, and word is she's going to the highest bidder." The fence post slipped from Jake's hands and hit the ground with a thud. For a moment, he felt something stir inside him that he hadn't felt in 3 years. It was anger, but not the dull, constant anger he'd been carrying around. This was sharp and focused, the kind of anger that made you want to do something about it. "What kind of guys?" Jake asked, his voice quieter than usual. "The kind that don't take no for an answer," Tommy replied. "Linda's scared for her. Says Rosa shows up to work sometimes with bruises, always looking over her shoulder. And now with this thing her boyfriend's got going." Jake stood there in the afternoon sun, holding a hammer in his hand and feeling something wake up inside him that had been sleeping for too long. He thought about his late wife and how she used to volunteer at the women's shelter in the next county over. She always said that sometimes good people had to step up when bad things were happening, even if it wasn't convenient or easy. "Where's this woman now?" Jake asked. "Still at the apartment with her boyfriend, far as Linda knows." "Look, boss, these aren't people you want to mess with. They're talking serious money, and some of the interested parties, they're not local, if you know what I mean." Jake nodded slowly. He knew exactly what Tommy meant. And for the first time in 3 years, he felt like he had a reason to care about something other than just getting through another day. That night, Jake sat on his porch with a beer he didn't really want, thinking about a woman he'd never met, who needed help he might be able to give. The ranch felt different somehow, like it was waiting for something to happen. And maybe, just maybe, Jake was ready to stop being a ghost in his own life and start being a man who could make a difference. Again. Jake didn't sleep that night. He sat at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours ago, staring at the phone number Tommy had written on a piece of paper. It was Danny's number, and Jake had been turning that scrap of paper over in his hands since midnight, trying to figure out what kind of man he was about to become. He'd never done anything like this before. The closest he'd come to breaking the law was driving 5 miles over the speed limit, and here he was planning to pay money to essentially buy a human being. But every time he thought about backing down, he remembered Tommy's words about the kind of men who were interested in Rosa, and his stomach would twist into knots. When the sun finally came up, Jake knew what he had to do. He drove to the bank in town and withdrew $15,000 in cash. The teller, Mrs. Peterson, raised her eyebrows but didn't ask questions. In a small town, people minded their own business, especially when it came to Jake Morrison, who'd been through enough tragedy for one lifetime. The money felt heavy in his jacket pocket as he drove to the address Tommy had given him. It was one of those apartment complexes where the paint was peeling and the parking lot had more potholes than pavement. Jake had never been in this part of town before, and it made him realize how sheltered his life on the ranch had been. Danny answered the door on the second knock. He was younger than Jake had expected, maybe 35, with the kind of nervous energy that came from looking over your shoulder too much. His eyes went straight to Jake's truck in the parking lot, taking in the clean paint and good tires, like he was calculating what it might be worth. "You the guy Tommy mentioned?" Danny asked, not bothering with pleasantries. "That's right," Jake replied, keeping his voice steady even though his heart was pounding. "I understand you might have some help available for my ranch." It was a dance they both knew they were doing, using words that meant something different than what they were saying. Danny invited him in, and Jake got his first look at the place where Rosa had been living. The apartment was small and dark, with heavy curtains that blocked out most of the sunlight. It smelled like cigarettes and fear. Rosa was sitting on the couch, and when she looked up at Jake, he felt something crack inside his chest. She was pretty in a way that reminded him of wildflowers growing in places where they shouldn't be able to survive. But it was her eyes that got to him. They were the eyes of someone who had learned not to hope for anything good to happen. "Rosa, this is Jake," Danny said, his hand falling possessively on her shoulder. "He's got a ranch outside town. Needs someone to help with cooking and cleaning." She nodded but didn't speak. Jake could see the bruises on her wrists where Danny's fingers had pressed too hard, and he had to clench his fist to keep from doing something stupid right there in the living room. "What kind of work are we talking about?" Jake asked, though. He hated himself for playing along with Danny's game. "Whatever you need," Danny said with a grin that made Jake's skin crawl. "Rosa's real good with housework, cooking, cleaning, laundry. She'd take care of whatever needs taken care of." The way he said it made Jake want to punch him, but violence wouldn't help Rosa. Jake pulled out an envelope with the money and set it on the coffee table. "This should cover her wages for the first year," he said. "Plus a little extra for your ... Danny's eyes lit up when he saw the cash. He picked up the envelope and flipped through the bills, counting quickly. "This'll work just fine," he said. "When do you want her to start?" "Now," Jake said, looking directly at Rosa. "If that's okay with you?" It was the first time anyone had asked her opinion about anything in months, and Rosa looked surprised by the question. She glanced at Danny, who was still focused on counting the money, then back at Jake. Something in his face must have told her he was different from the other men who had been coming around, because she nodded slowly. "I'll get my things," she said quietly. It took her less than 10 minutes to pack everything she owned into a single duffel bag. That broke Jake's heart more than anything else he'd seen that day. A whole life reduced to what could fit in one bag, and most of it was clothes that looked like they'd been chosen by someone else. The drive to the ranch was quiet. Rosa sat pressed against the passenger door like she was ready to jump out if Jake turned out to be like all the others. He wanted to say something to reassure her, but he didn't know what words could possibly fix what she'd been through. Instead, he turned on the radio to a country station and drove the speed limit, trying to show her through his actions that he wasn't in any hurry to get her alone. When they pulled into the ranch driveway, Rosa looked around at the open fields and the mountains in the distance, like she was seeing the sky for the first time in years. "It's beautiful," she whispered, and Jake felt something warm spread through his chest at the wonder in her voice. He showed her to the guest room, which had been his wife's sewing room before the accident. He'd cleaned it out the night before, putting in a bed and dresser he'd bought from the furniture store in town. It wasn't fancy, but it was clean and private, with a window that looked out over the garden. "This is yours," he said, setting her bag on the bed. "There's a lock on the door, and you're the only one who has the key." Rosa stared at the key like it was something magical. "Really? Really? And Rosa?" Jake waited until she looked at him. "I know what you've been through." "What?" "Danny was doing to you." "But that's not what this is. I need help with the house, and you need a safe place to stay. That's all this is." She nodded, but didn't look convinced. Jake didn't blame her. After what she'd been through, trust would have to be earned one day at a time. "I'll be in the kitchen if you need anything," he said, backing toward the door. "Take your time getting settled." The first few days were like walking on eggshells. Rosa would appear in the kitchen before dawn to start breakfast, then disappear again as soon as Jake finished eating. She cleaned the house like her life depended on it, scrubbing floors that were already clean and organizing closets that hadn't been opened in years. Jake tried to give her space, but it was hard to ignore how she flinched whenever he moved too quickly or raised his voice to call the dogs in from outside. She ate her meals standing at the counter, ready to run if he got angry about something. When he tried to tell her she could sit at the table, she just shook her head and kept eating with her back to the wall. The breakthrough came on the fourth day, when Jake found her crying in the laundry room. She was holding one of his shirts, and at first he thought she'd damaged it somehow. But when he looked closer, he realized she was crying because she'd gotten a small stain out of the fabric. "I'm sorry," she said, wiping her eyes. "I didn't mean to. I just haven't been able to fix anything in so long." "Hey," Jake said gently, "it's okay. You're doing great. The house hasn't been this clean in years." She looked up at him with those careful eyes. "You're not mad? Mad? Rosa, you've been working yourself to death for 4 days. If anything, I'm worried you're doing too much." That seemed to confuse her more than anything. The idea that someone might worry about her working too hard was foreign to her. But Jake could see something shift in her expression, like maybe she was starting to believe that this place might actually be different from everywhere else she'd been that night. For the first time since she'd arrived, Rosa didn't lock her bedroom door. It was a small thing, but Jake noticed, and it gave him hope that maybe, eventually, she might start to feel safe in his home. 2 weeks had passed since Rosa arrived at the ranch, and Jake was starting to understand that healing wasn't something that happened overnight. She still moved through the house like she was walking on thin ice, careful not to make too much noise or take up too much space. But there were small changes that gave him hope. She had started humming while she worked, just quietly under her breath, but Jake could hear it when he came in for lunch. It was usually old songs, the kind his own mother used to sing while she cooked dinner. The sound made the house feel alive in a way it hadn't since the accident. One morning, Jake was drinking his coffee on the back porch when he noticed something that made him stop mid-sip. Rosa was in the garden behind the house, kneeling in the dirt with her hands deep in the soil. The vegetable patch had been his wife's pride and joy, but after she died, Jake couldn't bear to look at it, let alone maintain it. He'd let it go. Wild, and now it was more weeds than vegetables. But Rosa was out there pulling weeds like her life depended on it, carefully separating the good plants from the bad ones. She'd found an old pair of gardening gloves in the shed and was wearing one of his flannel shirts over her clothes to protect them from the thorns. Jake watched her work for almost an hour, fascinated by the concentration on her face. She handled each plant like it mattered, like she understood that something beautiful was trying to grow in all that mess. When she finally stood up and brushed the dirt from her knees, she looked more relaxed than he'd ever seen her. He didn't say anything about the garden that day or the next, but he started leaving gardening tools where she could find them, and he noticed that she'd begun spending more time outside, coaxing life back into the neglected plants. The breakthrough came on a rainy Thursday evening when Jake came home from checking on the cattle to find Rosa in the kitchen, but this time she wasn't cleaning. She was standing at the stove, stirring something that smelled like heaven. The whole house was filled with the scent of garlic and herbs and something else he couldn't identify. "I hope you don't mind," she said without turning around. "I found some vegetables in the garden that were ready to harvest, and I thought maybe I could make dinner for both of us tonight." Jake's throat felt tight. "You don't have to cook for me, Rosa. That's not what this is about." "I know," she said. And for the first time since she'd arrived, she smiled. It was a small smile, careful and uncertain, but it was real. "I want to. I used to love cooking before everything. I forgot how much I missed it." They ate dinner together that night, sitting at the kitchen table like normal people. Rosa had made some kind of pasta dish with fresh tomatoes and basil from the garden, and it was the best meal Jake had tasted in 3 years. But more than that, it was the first time he'd shared a meal with another person since his wife died. "This is incredible," he said, taking another bite. "Where did you learn to cook like this?" Rosa's smile got a little bigger. "My grandmother. She came from Mexico when she was young, and she taught me all her recipes." She used to say that food was how you showed people you cared about them. She sounds like a wise woman. She was. Rosa's expression grew sad for a moment. I haven't made these dishes in years. Danny didn't. He didn't like me cooking food that reminded him I was Mexican. Said it smelled weird and made the apartment stink. Jake felt that familiar anger rise in his chest at the mention of Danny's name. Well, Danny's an idiot. This is the best meal I've had in longer than I can remember. They talked more that night than they had in all the previous weeks combined. Rosa told him about her grandmother's garden in California, how she'd learned to tell when tomatoes were ripe by their smell. Jake found himself talking about his wife, sharing memories he'd kept locked away for 3 years. She would have loved this garden, he said, looking out the window at the plants Rosa had been nurturing. She always said that gardens were like people, they just needed someone to believe in them to grow. What was her name? Rosa asked gently. And Morrison. She was the best person I ever knew. Rosa nodded like she understood. Danny used to tell me that Anne was lucky to have had you. That not everyone gets to be loved like that. It was the first time either of them had acknowledged that they were both carrying around the weight of their past relationships, though for very different reasons. Jake had lost someone who loved him completely, while Rosa had escaped someone who had used love as a weapon. The next morning, Jake woke up to the sound of Rosa singing in the kitchen. Not humming this time, but actually singing in Spanish while she made breakfast. Her voice was clear and sweet, and it filled the house with a warmth that had been missing for too long. When he came downstairs, she was making pancakes and had already fed the dogs, who were lying contentedly by the back door. She looked up when she heard his footsteps, and Jake realized that she wasn't watching him with that careful, fearful expression anymore. She was just looking at him like a person looking at another person. "Good morning," she said, and there was something lighter in her voice than he'd heard before. "Morning. Smells good in here. I thought you might be getting tired of cereal and toast," she said, flipping a pancake with practiced ease. "I found some fresh eggs in the henhouse. I hope that's okay." "Rosa, you don't have to ask permission to use food from the ranch. This is your home too?" The words surprised both of them. Jake hadn't meant to say it quite like that, but once it was out there, he realized it was true. Somewhere in the past few weeks, Rosa had stopped being a person he was helping and started being someone who belonged here. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for everything. I know what you did for me, and I know it wasn't normal. But I want you to know that I'm grateful. Not just for getting me away from Danny, but for treating me like a person. You are a person, Rosa. You're a good person who deserved better than what happened to you." She was quiet for a moment, focusing on the pancakes. "Sometimes I forget that. Sometimes I think maybe I deserved it because I was too weak to leave." "That's not weakness," Jake said firmly. "That's survival. And look at you now. You're bringing a dead garden back to life. You're making this house feel like a home again. That's not weak. That's strong." Later that day, Jake found Rosa in the garden again, but this time she wasn't alone. She was talking to the plants, telling them about the weather and what she was planning to cook with the vegetables they were growing. It reminded him of his wife, who used to have full conversations with her flowers, but it also reminded him of something else, the way Rosa had looked when she told him about being a teacher. There was a passion in her voice when she talked about children and learning, the same passion he could see now when she worked with the plants. "Rosa," he said as she was finishing up for the day, "can I ask you something?" She nodded, wiping her hands on a towel. "Do you miss teaching?" The question seemed to surprise her. "Every day. But I can't. I don't have the right clothes, and my certification might have expired. And I don't know if anyone would want to hire someone who just disappeared for 2 years. What if we figured it out? What if we found a way for you to get back to teaching?" For the first time since he'd known her, Rosa looked like she might cry from happiness instead of sadness. "You'd help me do that?" "Rosa, I'd help you do anything that would make you happy. You've given me more in these past few weeks than I've had in 3 years. If teaching is what you want to do, then we'll figure out how to make it happen." night, Rosa didn't just unlock her bedroom door, she left it open. It was a small gesture, but it told Jake that she was finally starting to believe that she was safe in his house. And maybe, just maybe, they were both starting to believe that they could build something good together from the broken pieces of their past. Winter came early that year, and with it came a closeness that neither Jake nor Rosa had expected. The first snowfall arrived in late October, blanketing the ranch in a thick white silence that made the world feel smaller and more intimate. Rosa had never experienced a real winter before. She'd grown up in Southern California, where the coldest it got was maybe 60 degrees, and Danny had kept her isolated in that stuffy apartment for 2 years. So when she woke up to see the entire ranch transformed into something that looked like a Christmas card, she pressed her face against the window like a child seeing magic for the first time. "Jake," she called out, her voice filled with wonder. "You have to see this." He found her in the living room, still in her pajamas, watching the snow fall through the big picture window. Her breath was fogging up the glass and she was tracing patterns in the condensation with her finger. "It's so quiet," she whispered. "I've never heard quiet like this." Jake stood beside her, close enough that he could smell the shampoo she used, something with lavender that reminded him of his wife's garden. But instead of the sharp pain that usually came with those memories, he felt something softer. Like, maybe the past didn't have to hurt so much when you had someone to share the present with. "Gets a lot quieter than this," he said. "Wait until we get snowed in." Rosa looked at him with wide eyes. "Snowed in?" "Sometimes the snow gets so deep that the roads become impassable. Could be stuck here for days, just the two of us." 2 months ago, the thought of being trapped anywhere would have terrified Rosa. But now, looking at Jake's kind face and feeling the warmth of the house around her, she realized that being snowed in with him didn't sound scary at all. It sounded like the safest place in the world. The storm hit 3 days later. Rosa woke up to find snow drifted up to the windows and the power flickering on and off. Jake was already up, feeding wood into the fireplace and checking the generator. "How bad is it?" she asked, wrapping one of his flannel shirts around her shoulders. "Bad enough. We're not going anywhere for a while." Instead of panic, Rosa felt something that might have been excitement. For the first time in years, she was cut off from the outside world, but she wasn't trapped. She was safe with someone who cared about her. In a house that had started to feel like home, they spent the morning making breakfast together, working around each other in the kitchen with an ease that had developed over the past few weeks. Rosa had become comfortable enough to bump into Jake's shoulder when she reached for something, and he'd started leaving his hand on the small of her back when he moved past her. Small touches that said more than words ever could. "I should probably teach you how to take care of the animals," Jake said as they ate pancakes by the fireplace. "Just in case something happens to me." "Nothing's going to happen to you," Rosa said quickly, and the fear in her voice surprised them both. Jake looked at her carefully. "Hey, I'm not going anywhere. I just meant it's good to know these things. Makes you more independent." The word independent hung in the air between them. Rosa had been financially dependent on Danny, emotionally dependent on his approval, physically dependent on his permission to leave the apartment. The idea of being truly independent was both thrilling and terrifying. "I'd like that," she said. "I'd like to learn." So Jake taught her how to milk the cows, how to check the chickens for eggs, how to break ice on the water trough so the animals could drink. Rosa was a quick learner, and she seemed to genuinely enjoy the work. There was something peaceful about the routine of caring for living things, and Jake could see her confidence growing with each task she mastered. On the third day of being snowed in, Rosa made a discovery that changed everything. She was cleaning out a closet in the guest room when she found a box of books hidden behind some old coats. They were children's books, the kind teachers used in elementary schools, and many of them had lesson plans tucked between the pages. "Jake," she called out, her voice trembling with excitement. "Whose are these?" He came to look and felt his breath catch. "Those were Anne's. She was going to be a teacher before we got married, and she decided to help me with the ranch. Instead, she always said she'd go back to it someday." Rosa ran her fingers over the books like they were precious artifacts. She was going to teach children, elementary school. She loved kids, always said they were the best part of the world because they still believed in magic. Jake, would it be okay if I look through these? I promise I'll be careful. Rosa, you don't have to ask permission. If Anne were here, she'd be thrilled that someone who loved teaching as much as she did was going to use them. That night, Rosa stayed up late reading through Anne's lesson plans and making notes in a journal she'd found in the kitchen. Jake woke up around midnight to find her still at the kitchen table, surrounded by books and papers, completely absorbed in her work. You should get some sleep, he said gently. I can't. This is ... Jake, your wife was brilliant. These lesson plans are amazing. She found ways to make math fun, to make science feel like an adventure. Look at this. She showed him a plan for teaching fractions using pizza slices and cookies. Anne had drawn little diagrams and written notes about which kids might need extra help and which ones could be peer tutors. She was going to be an incredible teacher, Rosa said softly. I can see it in everything she wrote. She really understood how children learn. Jake sat down beside her, looking at his wife's handwriting. For the first time since she died, usually seeing her things made him feel like his chest was caving in. But tonight, with Rosa's enthusiasm filling the room, he felt something different. He felt proud of Anne and grateful that her work might help someone else pursue their dreams. You know what I think, he said. I think Anne would want you to have these. Not just to look at, but to use. To become the teacher you were meant to be. Rosa looked up at him with tears in her eyes. Do you really think so? I know so. And I think we should start making calls tomorrow. Find out what you need to do to get your certification current. See if there are any openings at the local school. The next morning, the snow had stopped and the roads were passable again. But something had changed during those 3 days of being snowed in together. Rosa and Jake had crossed some invisible line from being two people sharing a house to being two people sharing a life, Rosa called the school district that afternoon, and Jake drove her to town the next day for a meeting with the principal. She wore one of Anne's old dresses, which fit her perfectly, and carried a folder full of lesson plans and ideas. The principal, Mrs. Anderson, was a kind woman in her 50s who had been looking for a substitute teacher for weeks. She was impressed by Rosa's knowledge and enthusiasm, and even more impressed by the creative lesson plans she'd developed using Anne's books as inspiration. When can you start? Mrs. Anderson asked. Tomorrow, Rosa said without hesitation. Jake was waiting in the truck when Rosa came out of the school building. She was practically glowing with excitement, and when she got in the passenger seat, she threw her arms around him before she could stop herself. I got the job, she said, her face pressed against his shoulder. Jake, I got the job. He held her for a long moment, breathing in the scent of her hair and feeling something warm and hopeful spread through his chest. I'm proud of you, he sighed, and meant it more than he'd meant anything in a long time. But their happiness was about to be shattered. As they drove home from town, Jake noticed a familiar car parked at the gas station. It was Danny's beat-up sedan, and Danny was standing beside it, talking on his phone with the kind of angry gestures that meant trouble was coming. Jake drove past without stopping, but he could see Danny in the rearview mirror watching their truck with the kind of attention that made Jake's blood run cold. Danny was supposed to be long gone, but he was back, and Jake had a feeling that their peaceful life at the ranch was about to get a lot more complicated. That night, Jake checked all the locks twice and made sure his shotgun was loaded. Rosa noticed his nervousness but didn't ask about it. She was too excited about starting her new job to worry about shadows from her past, but the shadows were there, and they were getting closer. Rosa had been teaching for 3 weeks when Danny finally made his move. She'd been coming home every day with stories about her students, her face bright with the kind of happiness Jake hadn't seen since she arrived. The children loved her, and she loved them back with a fierceness that reminded Jake why she'd become a teacher in the first place. Today, little Maria finally understood fractions. Rosa said over dinner, using her hands to show Jake how she'd explained it. She was so excited that she taught it to the boy sitting next to her. I swear, Jake, there's nothing better than watching a child's face light up when they finally get it. Jake loved these dinner conversations. Rosa would tell him about her day, and he'd share stories about the ranch, about the cows who had personalities, and the horses who thought they were smarter than he was. They'd started cooking together most evenings, Rosa teaching Jake her grandmother's recipes, while he showed her how to make the hearty meals that kept a rancher going through long days. It felt like a real life, the kind of life Jake had thought he'd never have again. Rosa had her own routine now, her own friends at school, her own income. She'd insisted on paying Jake rent, which he'd tried to refuse until she explained that paying her own way was important to her sense of independence. I need to know I can take care of myself, she'd said. Not because I don't trust you, but because I never want to be helpless again. Jake understood that. He'd seen how much stronger she'd become in the months since leaving Danny. She stood straighter now, spoke up for herself, made decisions without looking around for permission. She was becoming the person she was meant to be before fear had made her small. But on this particular Friday evening, their peaceful world was about to be shattered. Jake was in the barn checking on a mare who was due to foal when he heard a car door slam in the driveway. He looked out to see Danny's sedan, and his blood immediately turned to ice. Danny was drunk. Jake could tell from the way he was walking, that swaggering, aggressive stride that meant he was looking for trouble. He was also thinner than Jake remembered, with the hollow look of someone who'd been living hard and making bad choices. Jake grabbed his shotgun from the rack in the barn and walked toward the house. He could hear Danny pounding on the front door, shouting Rosa's name and demanding she come out. Through the window, Jake could see Rosa frozen in the kitchen, her face white with terror. "Rosa!" Danny yelled, his voice slurred but full of rage. "I know you're in there. You think you can just disappear? You think you can make me look like a fool?" Jake stepped onto the porch, the shotgun held low but visible. "She's not going anywhere with you, Danny. You need to leave." Danny spun around, his eyes wild. He'd clearly been drinking for hours, maybe days. "Well, if it isn't the hero," he sneered. "You think you're so smart, don't you? Taking what belongs to me." "Rosa doesn't belong to anyone," Jake said calmly. "She's a free woman, and she's chosen to stay here." "Free?" Danny laughed, but there was no humor in it. "She's not free. She's mine. I raised her, I fed her, I put a roof over her head. She owes me." "The only thing she owed you was a chance to leave, and you took that away from her." Danny's face twisted with anger. "You don't understand what she's like? She's weak. She's nothing without someone to take care of her. She come crawling back to me when she realizes you're just using her too." That's when Rosa appeared in the doorway. Jake had expected her to be cowering, to be the frightened woman who'd arrived at his ranch months ago. But the woman standing behind him was different. She was scared, but she was also angry, and she was done being afraid. "No, Danny," she said, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "I won't be coming back. Not now, not ever." "You don't get to make that choice," Danny snarled, taking a step toward the porch. "You're coming with me right now." She said no, Jake said, raising the shotgun slightly. "That's the only answer you need." Danny's hand moved toward his jacket, and Jake's finger tightened on the trigger. But before anyone could make a move they'd regret, the sound of sirens filled the air. Sheriff Martinez and 2 deputies were pulling into the driveway, their lights flashing. Tommy had been watching from the road, Jake realized. Smart Kid had called the law the moment he saw Danny's car heading toward the ranch. "Danny Rodriguez," Sheriff Martinez called out as he got out of his cruiser. "You're under arrest for violating the restraining order." "What restraining order?" Danny demanded, but Jake could see the fear creeping into his eyes. "The one Rosa filed last week," the sheriff said, walking toward them with his hand on his weapon. "She's been keeping track of your activities, Danny. We know about the gambling debts, the threats, the men you've been talking to about paying them back. You're done." Rosa stepped forward, and Jake saw something in her face that made his chest swell with pride. She was standing tall, her shoulders back, looking Danny in the eye without flinching. "I'm not the same person I was when I lived with you," she said clearly. I have a job now, and friends, and a life that doesn't include being afraid of you. I'm not going anywhere. Danny made one last desperate lunge toward the porch, but Jake was ready for him. He stepped between Danny and Rosa, the shotgun now pointed directly at Danny's chest. "Don't," Jake said quietly. "Just don't." The deputies moved in then, cuffing Danny and reading him his rights while he screamed threats and curses. As they loaded him into the patrol car, he looked back at Rosa one last time. "This isn't over," he shouted. "You'll never be free of me." "Yes, I will," Rosa said, and Jake could hear the certainty in her voice. "I already am." After the police left, Jake and Rosa sat on the porch swing, watching the sunset paint the mountains purple and gold. Rosa was quiet, processing everything that had happened, and Jake was giving her space to work through her emotions. "I filed the restraining order last week," she said finally. "I should have told you, but I wanted to handle it myself. Sheriff Martinez said Danny's been asking questions around town, trying to find out where I lived and worked. They've been watching him." "You did good," Jake said. "You stood up to him." "A year ago, could you have done that?" Rosa thought about it. "No, a year ago I would have gone with him just to avoid making him angrier, but I'm not that person anymore." She looked at Jake. "You helped me remember who I was before I met him. You helped me remember that I'm worth fighting for." "You were always worth fighting for, Rosa. You just needed someone to remind you." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the stars come out. Finally, Rosa spoke again. "Jake, I need to tell you something. These past few months, living here with you, they've been the happiest of my life. Not just because I'm safe, but because I'm with you. I think I'm falling in love. With you? And I need to know if that's okay." Jake felt his heart skip a beat. He'd been hoping she felt the same way he did, but he'd been afraid to say anything, afraid of pressuring her after everything she'd been through. "More than okay," he said, taking her hand. "I love you too, Rosa. I have for weeks now." She smiled. Then the first completely unguarded smile he'd ever seen from her. "Really? Really? I love how you sing while you cook, how you talk to the plants in the garden, how your face lights up when you talk about your students. I love how strong you are, how kind you are, how you make this house feel like a home again." "I love you too," she said, leaning against his shoulder. "I love how patient you were with me, how you never pushed me to be ready before I was ready. I love how you make me feel safe and valued and free all at the same time." 6 months later, they were married in a small ceremony in the backyard, surrounded by Rosa's students and their families, Jake's ranch hands, and the friends they'd made in town. Rosa wore a simple white dress and carried flowers from the garden she'd brought back to life. During the ceremony, Jake had a moment where he could swear he felt his first wife's presence, not as a ghost haunting his happiness, but as a blessing on his new beginning. He'd loved Anne with everything he had, and he knew she would have wanted him to find love again. Rosa had quit her substitute position to take a full-time teaching job at the elementary school. She'd also started a small garden club for her students, teaching them how to grow vegetables and flowers. Jake would sometimes stop by the school to watch her work, amazed by how naturally she connected with children, how she made learning feel like an adventure. Their life wasn't perfect. They both still had bad days, moments when the past would catch up with them. But they faced those moments together, and that made all the difference. On their first anniversary, Rosa surprised Jake with a photo album she'd made of their year. Together, the pictures showed their journey from two broken people to a couple who had found healing in each other. The last picture was of them working in the garden together, both of them laughing at something one of them had said. "Look how far we've come," Rosa said, curled up beside him on the couch as they looked through the album. "Look how far we're going to go," Jake replied, kissing the top of her head. They both learned that love wasn't just about finding someone to share your life with. It was about finding someone who helped you become the person you were meant to be. And in each other they'd found exactly that.